Hi, and welcome back to Police Stories podcast. I'm Dave, and this is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the police. Downloads continue to go well, thank you. More and more people coming on board listening, which is nice, from such varied places across the world. It continues to amaze me, this sort of how widespread the podcast is getting, but please assist with that and tell people you think may be interested to get some more listeners. So today we're going to talk about a helicopter attachment that I had fairly early on in my career. I was within my first year or so of service, and I can't remember whether I knew someone or whether I basically approached the sort of helicopter unit direct and said, look, I'm fairly new to the job. Is there any chance of coming along to see what you do for the day, And this was something they were quite used to. They were based at a commercial airport. I say commercial, we're not talking a massive airport like Heathrow or something. It was a much smaller sort of airport that took in, light aircraft, but also had this helicopter base there, the police helicopter at the time. And this particular helicopter was made up of 3 crew. It varied at the time again. It hadn't been sort of standardised, so different sort of forces did different things. Sometimes police shared an ambulance helicopter and vice versa, but in our particular force at the time, the makeup was the pilot. Then you had an air observer who was like a navigator stroke extra crewman, and they had a certain amount of training in and around the aircraft for safety checks and things to assist the pilot. And then also they carried a paramedic as well. So fantastic resource, had all the sort of bases covered. Anyway, I knew we had this opportunity to go along and have a day there. Now, of course, I think a friend or two of mine had done it and they'd had nothing happen all day. It's just the luck of the draw. You can't make stuff happen. So you just go along and you commit a day to it and you see what happens. I mean, if nothing else is interesting, looking around the aircraft and understanding what they do. And they had some, videos of sort of things they'd been to before, just to sort of keep you occupied. So I'd gone along for this day, and I think you worked a kind of fairly standard, 9 to 5 sort of day shift. I'd gone along, and the crew had a really nice life, to be honest with you. They had a gym there. They had access to, a TV and their food and a small kitchen and things. And they basically, they did wait, for a call. It wasn't like they went out on patrol for the sake of it, because obviously to run a helicopter was, or is, particularly expensive. So it's not the sort of thing you took out for a spin. But they were requested so much that they were out virtually every day. And now that's definitely the case. So we went along, and I, had access to the police computers there, and I was sitting around. And early on, once I'd had my tour of the aircraft, and they'd shown me where I would sit and what would happen if there was a shout, and I think we refueled the aircraft. So it was a really interesting time from my point of view. But they talked around some of the jobs they'd been to, and one of the old sweats there that had been there, a long time and had kind of 20 or 30 years in the job, and I was looking up to very much as, this experienced god of policing, as someone with a year in who would have been sort of 22. I was like, I really hope we get a job today. He kind of nodded, sagely, and was like, yeah, be careful what you wish for, and I was thinking, what does he know? I just want to get out and do something exciting. So we sat around, and we sat around, and we sat around, and there were several kind of calls that were bubbling, different things, how many accidents, and then I think there was a stabbing, and bits that looked like they could involve us, but invariably it was decided that, we weren't required. So that didn't happen. So every time my hopes were getting out that, this is it, we're going to get a call. No, nothing. So frustrating. Anyway, it came to about 4:45. Literally, the crew was just getting ready to leave, because they worked a 9 to 5, and they handed over, I think, to a late crew. Or in fact, no, I think they handed over to a night crew. It was sort of manned 24 hours a day, this helicopter, because that wasn't always the case. Sometimes there was a call out. So we were literally 15 minutes from the shift ending, and a call came in. On the surface didn't sound that exciting, but it was a woman had fallen off her horse and had injured her neck, and she was quite rural. And not only were they finding it difficult to find her, but also the assumption was that if they did find her, that they were going to struggle to actually be able to get her out, to an ambulance or potentially to a hospital. So we were tasked to go. So they gave me the option, look, we're basically finished for the day, but we are going to go up. So it's up to you if you want to stay on. Well, of course, I didn't need to be asked twice. I was running for the aircraft the same as they were. And I thought, this is it. This is my chance. Fantastic. So jumped in the helicopter. It took off. I'd never been in a helicopter, I don't think, at this point. Certainly not one that had taken off. So we took off, and it was about a 15-minute flight. I think at the time we could cover the entire county within an hour. It was about a 15-minute flight to this particular location. And without a doubt, the pilots, which are all ex-military, so they really knew their stuff. They're very good pilots and used to flying helicopters low, and I think it's called nap of the earth flying, where they hug the contours of the ground to prevent being shot down, in a wartime situation. These guys were really good. So he showed off without doubt on the way, and probably did his best to try and make me sick. I think that was generally the plan, make the new guy sick. That'd be entertaining. So we did exactly that. We did some fairly low flying, it was very rural. So he was very much sort of following the contours of the ground, and it was basically, it felt like to me, flinging the aircraft around quite a bit. And certainly when we got to where we were heading, we could see the female on the ground, and I think there was a couple of people with them, and they had like some fluorescent clothing on or something. They were waving their arms at us, so we were reasonably confident this was them. That the horse had already bolted, and I think that was the issue, and the woman was lying on the ground. So we circled a couple of times. Now, actually, I'd been all right in terms of feeling sick going there when he was doing his best, to try and make me feel sick. But when we circled a couple of times, he had the nose of the helicopter dipped quite low as we were circling, and actually the circling was making me sick. I think I said on the last one that I struggled a bit on fairground rides and things, not feeling sick, and this wasn't helping anyway. So I was quite relieved when we eventually put down quite near the woman. And actually, around about the same time we arrived, an ambulance had managed to get through the rural roads and find her. So we went over. She did have a neck injury. It wasn't terrible, but they kind of, assessed her and assisted the local paramedics. But then it was decided that actually, because of a neck injury, they were going to transport her by road anyway. So we weren't there that long, probably half an hour or so tops. And she was loaded into the ambulance and taken by road, but it was a good opportunity for me to have a flight. And of course, on the way back, the favourite trick was we had a very, very large cliff nearby. I think it was 600 feet down to the beach. And unfortunately, it was a notorious sort of suicide spot. And the pilot did his favourite thing, which was took us over to the edge of the cliff and basically said, have you ever wondered what it's like, to jump off a cliff? And I was kind of like, no, why would I? But he said, well, I'll show you. So we went over the edge of the massive cliff, and then he dropped very rapidly the other side. And your stomach really comes up and sort of sits in the back of your throat. So they all thought it was hugely amusing. Of course, you can imagine I wasn't quite so happy, and I was eyeing where the sick bags were just in case, but desperately trying to save face by not being sick in front of these guys. So we headed back to the base and we landed, and that was brilliant. And to be honest with you, I was happy with that. I thought that's a good day. I know I've sat around for a lot, but actually I've had a flight and I know how it works. It's really great. And so we packed up. We pretty much had our sort of civilian jackets on and were stepping out the door, turning the lights off to the office when the kind of bat phone rang, as they called it, the big red phone that means it's a job and an important job. So they ran back over and picked it up, and now this one was very different. This was much worse. This was a really serious accident involving 3 nurses that had been on a charity walk. Now, I'm not massively religious, but some of the jobs you go to, you do come away wondering from, where is the justice in the world? How can this be right? You can get quite sort of deep and philosophical about these things, but This was 3 nurses on a charity walk, had been wiped out by a car basically, and they were asking urgently for the ambulance, for the helicopter. So, well, and the ambulance as well. So it was decided that we would go back in. I was asked again, look, you are finished. You can go if you want. And I was like, absolutely not. I'm coming to this. So all jumped back on board. The aircraft flew off. It was quite a long flight. It was right at the edge of our grounds. I think it was kind of half an hour, 40 minutes. So plenty of time to think about, what was going to happen and how could I help and what was I going to do. And I was a little bit nervous about the medical side of things because I'd actually been to an accident myself, me and a pal, with a guy. We'd pretty much just been released by ourselves, that we were sort of fit for independent duty. So we were allowed to go out ourselves, and they'd actually decided to put me and a guy I joined with together. Or in fact, I think he had about a month more service than me. So we were really new, and we were chuffed that it was like letting the puppies out to play. And typically we'd been right on the edge of our ground, and there'd been a call to an accident, no details. It's been an accident, that's it, no details. So you didn't know whether it was literally a minor bump, a fender bender, or whether it was more serious. We turned up to this job, and there was a guy lying on the floor next to his car, and there was what's called a bullseye on the windscreen of the car. So basically a circular sort of smash that looks a bit like a spider's web, but it was pushed out from the inside. And you see them quite a lot of accidents, and they're generally called bullseyes. And normally the person's not been wearing a seatbelt, so their head has hit the windscreen on the impact of the crash. So there was a really big bullseye, and actually something had come through the windscreen as well on this guy. And I'm never quite sure how he got his injury, but he was laying relatively calmly beside his car. And we'd gone running up, and my friend had gone off to deal with the other person. I was speaking to this one. And while he was laying there saying that he felt really calm but a bit weird and what have you, on the top of his head there was something white, and I couldn't really make out what it was. There was this triangular shape on the top of his skull, and the closer I looked, I realised that actually the top of his skull in this triangular shape was actually missing. There was no hair, there was no sort of bone, and it was almost quite neatly cut out at the top of his head. And I could see this white at the top of his skull where this triangular shape was. And apparently there's a membrane that actually, a white membrane that actually covers the brain. And that's what I was looking at. He's actually, the top of his skull was missing in this shape. And I just couldn't believe what I was looking at, especially as I was speaking to this guy. And he was saying to me, oh, is it bad? Am I okay? And I was kind of looking at it, oh, no, it's fine. Thinking in the back of my mind, I have no idea what I'm going to do here. And for all I know, this is going to be fatal. So I was trying to reassure the guy, but I'm looking round, and on the floor next to him was this neat triangular shape clump of hair. So I picked it up, I had gloves on, picked it up, and realised that it was this piece of his skull and I'm still not quite sure how that had been cut out, smashed out. It was probably the thing that had come through the windscreen, which I think was a piece of metal from another vehicle. And I basically didn't know what to do with it. You get first aid training in the police. Certainly years ago, it was fairly basic. It's a lot better now. But at the end of the day, you're still a police officer first and foremost with some first aid skills. You're nothing else. The first aid kits that we carried were certainly at that point, quite frankly, woeful. Again, they've really come on now. But at the time, there was this crumpled green bag in the back, and there'd be a shout go up at an accident or a stabbing or a fight or something, get the first aid kit. And members of the public would be looking at you thinking that you were going to come out of the back of the police car with this amazing kit that you pressed a button and an inflatable, fully equipped, hospital sprang up, and everyone was going to be really impressed. And the reality is you went to this crumpled bag that barely got touched in the back of the police car. You brought it out. You opened it up to realise that it was virtually empty apart from a single box of plasters. You'd then proudly get out your box of plasters, open those to realise they were empty because everyone who'd cut their finger at the nick had basically used them. So, the first aid kits were horrendous. And as I say, our training was pretty basic. Clearly, I was in no way equipped to deal with this guy who had a piece of his skull missing. So I didn't really know what to do. I had gloves on. I had this piece of skull in my hand. I basically picked it up and fairly neatly tried to put it back into the hole in his skull, which it did. It fitted, obviously, quite well. So I just sort of popped it on there, almost gave it a little pat. And when the first paramedic turned up, told them what I'd done, and they kind of rolled their eyes and were like, yeah, you shouldn't have done that because you've now introduced infection, or you could have introduced infection. It turns out, thankfully, none of those things happened, but I was feeling pretty crestfallen. You can imagine basic first aid can never cover all scenarios. So I was all right putting plasters on, but putting pieces of skull back in, wasn't really my forte. Anyway, so back to our helicopter attachment. So en route to this horrible accident, I was quite nervous about dealing with the first aid side of it because of what had happened. I mean, I did have a paramedic with me, but I also knew on the way that there was 3 casualties. So I was fairly confident I was going to be, called to help out in some way. Anyway, so 40 odd minute journey, we arrive. Again, there's a certain amount more circling, and certainly I knew it was serious because the way the crew were acting, and also, the pilot had none of his kind of fancy flying on the way. It was just straight to the scene. He wasn't playing about. We put down in this field beside the main road, which is where this accident happened. And it had actually happened on an S-bend, quite a sort of squiggly S-bend through a rural part of the country. And basically these 3 nurses on a charity walk had been walking along the pavement, and there was actually a pavement, so as opposed to them walking on the road. A car, I think an Audi, had come through really fast, like somebody who's a wannabe race driver, which you see a lot, unfortunately, had come absolutely tanking through these bends. And because of what they were, there was a certain amount of loose gravel on them, and he'd lost it basically, and he'd lost this car, lost control of it, and it flipped over and hit all 3 of these nurses. And again, you can't help but thinking, where is the justice in that? These 3 nurses that are already in a fantastic job at helping people, and now they're doing a charity walk, in their spare time, and this happens to them. So when we arrived, one of the nurses was already a fatality. They decided there was nothing could be done with her. She'd been triaged. There was paramedics on scene, but they decided that unfortunately, she couldn't be saved, so she was covered. And this was probably one of the first fatal accidents I'd ever been to. So she was covered up. And there was, along the edge of the pavement, there was a series of really big and bushy sort of brambles, the sharp brambles that have all the horrible thorns in. And she was virtually buried within this stuff, but covered and dead, unfortunately. And then we had another one who was very, very serious, who I think they sort of scooped and run, as they call it, in the ambulance. She was bad, and the main hospital was fairly close, about 10 minutes away. So they'd done the real basic stuff to her, the minimum they could get away with to move her, slapped her on a trolley, and then got her away to the hospital, which left the third one. And once again, she was absolutely buried in these brambles. You'd have thought for all the world that they'd have laid her there and then planted the brambles and then waited, 20 years for them to grow to fully sort of enclose her. So we had to cut our way in with sort of snips that the paramedics carried, the tough cuts, I think they're called, cut away the brambles to actually get a sort of working space within where she was. Now, she was really, really pale, clearly in shock. Sort of her breathing was very rapid, and they were trying to calm her down and slow that breathing down, because that's never good, obviously. As I say, she was this real horrible sort of grey, pale colour, which, you didn't have to be medical to figure out that wasn't good. And they were trying to get hold of her breathing. I think she had a chest injury, so they were more worried about that and controlling that breathing. But as an aside, I could see, I think she had trousers on, and I could see quite clearly she had an open fracture to her thigh. So unfortunately, her femur, I believe it is, the main bone in the thigh, had snapped or had been broken by the impact of this car, and it had penetrated the skin in her thigh and was pushing out through her leg, basically. And, again, my understanding is bones are meant to be kind of white. This thing was really badly broken on the end, so it wasn't like a nice neat cut or anything. It almost looked like shark teeth on the end where it had either snapped. But I think, unfortunately, she'd then been dragged down the road once she'd had the initial impact that had broken this bone. So now you can imagine on the gravel path, this bone must have been getting ground along the tarmac and the gravel as well. So it had got broken up and sort of broken down more and been almost sanded down a bit as well. So I'm led to believe that it was sort of shorter than it should have been. But it looked horrible, it was black and grey and had bits of gravel sticking out of it. Again, this is all really bad from an infection point of view. So I was kind of getting flashbacks to the week before, but the difference was I had a paramedic with me and we were carrying really good medical kit, with people that knew what to do with it. And I don't include myself in that, or I didn't then. So I was handed quite a big, impressive looking dressing. There was some bleeding around the bone, but it wasn't terrible. But it was just the main sort of impact visually, of this jagged bone sticking out through her thigh. So the paramedic said, look, you just control that bleeding, just wrap that around. And he was basically trying to sort out this breathing issue at the top and on the chest side of things, whilst guiding me verbally what to do down here. And basically this was a special sort of donut dressing that went over top of the bone and around it. And it was a question of me threading the bone through the hole and then padding out with extra dressings around the base of the bone where it was puncturing the skin, and putting pressure now to stop the bleeding on this. But of course, you're terrified of hurting this person. I know it sounds ridiculous because they're seriously injured, but you don't want to push too hard because you're waiting for them to scream and tell you to get off. But unfortunately, she was very badly injured and, was far beyond sort of, individual things hurting her, I think. So I had what felt to me quite a lot of pressure down around this bone, pushing down to try and stop this bleeding with this big dressing. And ultimately, the bleeding did stop, but it took quite a while, and they did eventually bring her breathing under control. I think she had some broken ribs, possibly one of those had punctured her lungs, so that's why the breathing issue she was struggling with. But it ended up needing the fire brigade to come out as well to assist firstly with cutting the brambles and the sort of foliage back around us where we were trying to work, and then to actually assist in getting her out. And moving her was fairly horrific as well, because you can imagine she's got all these injuries. The last thing you want to do is move her, because it's going to hurt. But the reality is, you can't leave her there. So they had her loads of painkillers and gas and air and various injections she's had of, I assume, painkillers. So she was virtually unconscious, but we had to pretty unceremoniously drag her out of these bushes with the assistance of the fire brigade, get her onto a stretcher. And then again, because we were so close to the hospital, it was decided that she would be taken off by road to the hospital rather than going in the aircraft. There was an ability to load people into the aircraft, but I don't think it happened unless, you had quite a long journey to the actual hospital. So she was loaded and taken off. And I have to say, having finished with that incident, I was fairly affected by it. We were kind of walking back to the helicopter, and up until that point, on the way, well, not even on the way there, but throughout the day, there'd been a fair bit of banter between the three of us, or the four of us, and it was quite jovial. But this, I think, had affected all of us, to be honest with you. And these guys had been, to hundreds of these things. But this one particularly, I think, was, really, really unpleasant, particularly the circumstances. So got back onto the helicopter, and I still enjoyed the flight back and the whole day. But definitely on the way back, kind of the wise old sage, the old school cop that said to me about careful what you wish for, his words were ringing in my ear again about... I was thinking, wow, he was right, basically. You're thinking, I hope something exciting happens, but not too exciting like this. I'd never seen, broken bones, puncturing skin, etc., and the state of these injuries. But to have to be hands-on, with very limited first aid, was quite shocking, really. So it was it was quite a quiet and a somber drive home for me after that. But overall, again, it was an interesting day. I learned a huge amount, and it was really good to see how the helicopter operated and kind of what they wanted when they were called. And we even talked through about them assisting, or me assisting on the ground with them landing, in terms of directing them down and some hand signals and things. So yeah, it was a good day. It was interesting. But there we go. That's that incident. So that was episode 10, and next week we'll continue on, and we will come to some more funny and perhaps amusing stories in future. They're not all going to be doom and gloom, because you do go to a lot of funny things as well. But that's it for now. Thanks very much for listening. Yeah, please continue to download and pass it on to anyone you think may be interested. I'd appreciate it. But take it easy, and I'll speak to you soon. Cheers. Bye.